Hello, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple of seconds. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining Capalino's Future of New York series, focused on major issues facing New York City businesses and organizations. Today's topic is climate financing and affordable housing. As a leading urban strategy firm in New York, Capalino is focused on ensuring our clients achieve sustainable success in the New York region by complementing our 30 years of lobbying with expertise in finance, real estate, social impact, sustainability, and strategic planning. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Paul Leibowitz, Director of Capital Markets at Capalino, focused on Capalino Ventures, which helps our clients evaluate, transact, and capitalize multifaceted real estate projects. Because our advisory role here is always to look for optimal financing solutions on behalf of our clients, we thought it would be appropriate to discuss the various economic benefits resulting from the Inflation Reduction Act for energy efficient projects, the relation to local energy mandates, potential impact on affordable housing, and what steps real estate owners can take to take advantage of these opportunities. We assume some of you have various degrees of knowledge of this subject, but as many of the mandates and benefits are in their nascent stages, it is not often easy to navigate the myriad of programs and how to access these incentives, taking people months of research and digging to figure it all out. So our goal here is to significantly reduce that time frame, provide a bit of a primer, and discuss the major areas of benefits and next steps. We have a fantastic panel to do all this. I'll introduce them one by one. It includes Greg Hale. Greg is Senior Advisor for Energy Efficiency Markets and Finance, NYSERDA, leading an effort to create a policy roadmap to achieve a statewide carbon neutral building stock, and also provide oversight of the state's policy efforts related to energy efficiency financing, including an ongoing role as strategic advisor to New York Green Bank. Prior to joining NYSERDA in 2018, Greg served in Governor Cuomo's administration as senior advisor to the chairman of Energy and Finance, where he focused on the development and execution of the governor's signature energy policy, reforming the energy vision, and oversaw the establishment of the $1 billion New York Green Bank. Esther Toporovsky is Executive Vice President at New York City Housing Partnership. Esther has significant experience leading green capital and financing initiatives for affordable housing and community development projects across the country. She previously served as the Senior Program Director for National Initiatives for Enterprise Green Communities at Enterprise Community Partners. Prior to that, Esther was the Deputy Director at an environmental nonprofit that provided sustainable and social responsibility consulting. Esther also worked in business development and strategy for Yahoo and as a community development finance consultant. And finally, Jared Lang, Senior Advisor at HPDC Energy, is a specialist at infusing energy funding into the complicated financial structures of affordable housing. Jared has served as the Director of Sustainability for the National Housing Trust for 8 years, where he built a team that designed, financed, installed, and asset managed over 50 energy upgrades and 200 solar systems on affordable housing properties across the country. He also served as a sustainability consultant with AECOM, assisting developers in navigating the green building process. So we have a webinar that will last an hour. We have a presentation that we think will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll save the remainder for questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So with that, we'll get started.
Okay, I'll take this one, Paul. Thanks so much for the introduction, and just want to thank Capalino for setting up this conversation. I think it's really pertinent. This slide is just to kind of give an overview, just to kind of showcase that we're in a pretty unprecedented time in our history, just around sort of legislation and the fact that the U.S. has 400, almost 500 billion actually in capital that's going towards climate. So in particular, I know today we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. It was signed into law August 2022, and there's going to be federal funds directing spending around actually more than this 500 billion in spending and tax breaks to boost clean energy, to reduce carbon emissions, reduce healthcare costs, and increase sort of tax revenue. And this is just to showcase that states across the country are really working towards clean energy targets. from New York to California to red states to blue states to purple states to Louisiana, you name it. And it's really important for us to talk a lot about sort of New York and for New York to kind of do it right. We're sort of ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, and a lot of states are going to really follow and sort of showcase what they can do and follow the heels of what New York is moving towards. So Greg is going to kind of get us into going over the New York State and city climate goals to really get us started, and then we're going to kind of dive into more specifically how IRA can directly benefit affordable housing development projects from New York State to New York City. So Greg, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Esther, and thank you to Capalino for having me on. As Esther mentioned, I think this is really important stuff. And yeah, so let's look into what the regulatory drivers are here quickly that are going to make real estate owners and financiers move in a certain direction. And then we'll come back and start talking about funding opportunities to help you get that way, get in that direction. So 2019 was a big year in New York, where both New York City and New York State passed their own separate climate legislation. So it obviously adds a little complication. We need to make sure that these things are working well together and not conflicting, but they're generally going in the same direction. So if we talk about New York City, and I'll get into some more specifics on the next slides, but this their top line goal was an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. And in New York City, buildings constitute about 2/3 of the emissions because of the efficient mass transit. So if they're going to meet their greenhouse gas targets, buildings are a very important element of that situation. Also a big job creator. We think that's true both at the city and the state level, where some of the fastest employment growth is happening in green jobs, particularly in building efficiency. So then the state passed its Climate Act in 2019, setting a target for 85% reduction by 2050 with a bunch of specific targets on the way that we'll get into. It's important to note that both the state and the city have a very strong focus on equity and environmental justice in these laws. The state, in fact, requires that between 35 and 40% of the benefits of this transition to a clean energy economy flow to disadvantaged communities. The state set up a system to enable this. Both of these laws have essentially gone through the sausage making machine, and they're coming out the other side. The state set up a Climate Action Council that was tasked with developing the plan to reach a statewide carbon neutrality by the middle of the century, and they've done that. So we had a draft scoping plan come out at the end of 21. And then last year was a year of public comment and revisions, and we have a final scoping plan that was approved by this council in December of last year, about 3 months ago. And what that means is that anything that's in that plan that can be enacted through regulation is already happening. The Department of Environmental Conservation is tasked with developing those rules and regulations, and they're hard at work on that now. There are some elements, and I'll point to a couple of them building related, of the State Climate Act that do require another round of legislation. And a bunch of those things are in front of the legislature this year, this session, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that goes. I'm not going to really get into the IRA at this point. Esther and Jared are going to dive into that in great detail in a little bit. So next slide. So the city, this is a very interesting law. It is a building performance standard, but it was the first one that certainly in this country and perhaps anywhere that was focused on greenhouse gas reduction at the building level. So the limits that this law sets are about emissions. They're not about energy efficiency or energy use intensity. So it's a novel approach, and it sets caps on the amount of emissions that a building can emit. And those caps step down every 5 years. The critical point about Local Law 97 is it's just about to happen. The rules have been published, and the first compliance period starts in the next year, 2024, with the first report due in 2025. The first timeline was the cap level of the caps was set intentionally to only capture roughly a quarter of the worst performing building stock in the city in this first compliance period. But then, as I said, the cap stepped down, and in 2030, that limit is targeted at hitting 75% of the current performance of or buildings by their current performance. There is a bit of leniency for affordable housing, where you have more than 35% rent regulated units. Right now, you can do a set of prescriptive energy conservation measures and then call it good. But by 2035, those buildings are going to have to start hitting the cap. So they need to be making plans in that direction. So I'll stop there on Local Law 97. It's happening soon. The penalties are big. They could easily run into the tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And for, the biggest office buildings, if you're a really bad performer, the fines could be in the millions of dollars annually. So that's the point, is try to get the work done. We don't want to see a bunch of fines paid. We want to see this helping drive compliance, and the funding that's coming through the IRA should help. Next slide. So at the state level, a bunch of nicely colored circles here. But as I mentioned, 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but that's also supposed to be a carbon neutral economy. The other 15% are supposed to be made up by offsets or other actions taken at the state level. We're shooting for 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2040. And it sets some important standards, particularly on the grid. So if you look at those next two bubbles, 70% of our grid supplied energy needs to be from renewable energy by 2030. That's not that far away. We got a long way to go, but we got a bunch of stuff in the pipeline to actually deliver that. We're working very hard on offshore wind. A lot is happening in the background so that we can start actually building some offshore wind. Hopefully that will be, well, it's expected to be online by the mid portion of this decade. And then another major thing that we're doing is bringing more renewable energy down to New York City through two gigantic transmission projects, one coming down from Canada, Quebec, for hydropower under Lake Champlain and the Hudson River down to New York City, but the other one coming from sort of the Binghamton area, collecting a bunch of onshore wind and solar energy and bringing that down to New York City. And then by 2040, the act requires that our entire grid is 100% emissions free. And that's so critical, because when we're talking about building decarbonization, electrification really only works if you have a clean grid. But you do have the state investing a bunch of resources to get us to this clean grid and to build out the capacity of the grid that will be necessary to handle all the electrification. And there are a bunch of subsector goals about energy storage, rooftop solar, offshore wind, energy efficiency, all of which are important and part of the program. So next slide. So I think this is a really interesting and important development that the New York State's Department of Financial Services, DFS, it's our bank regulator. They had a busy weekend dealing with Signature Bank. But they came out in December of last year with proposed guidance to all of the financial entities that they regulate in New York State. They actually came out, they do insurance also, and had similar guidance earlier in the year. This was more for the financial institutions. But what they're saying, and this is proposed guidance, they're looking for comments back for a final rule coming forward sometime in 2023. But what they're saying is that climate creates serious risk to financial institutions and could impact their safety and soundness. And so what they want the banks to all do is to undertake an analysis of that risk and then react accordingly. And what the guidance does is provide some direction about how they should go about assessing the risk. And the risks are twofold. Physical, people, the physical risk people probably understand best. And that's just climate events, acute, whether it's a wildfire or a flood or a storm, and then chronic, which are things like temperature rising from year to year, it getting warmer, sea level rise along the coasts. So those are the physical risks, but there are also the transition risks. And this is really what we've been focused on, trying to get financial institutions to understand that as policy and legal regulations change, as technology evolves, as the market evolves, it can create preferences or actions on behalf of the owners of their underlying collateral. And remember, these are largely mortgage institutions, so they've got a big portfolio of loan collateral. And if that collateral all of a sudden gets knocked down and less valuable, well, we saw the outcome of that over this last weekend at Silicon Valley Bank and Signature. Signature was about, as I understand it, crypto risk, but it could come from anywhere. So it's really important. And then I believe that once we get the financial institutions looking at this, and then with disclosure obligations on the other side, this can have a major driving effect to the market. Next slide.
Greg, I just wanted to interrupt here
Sure.
because I know you nicely covered the physical risks and these transitional issues. But what I think top of mind for a lot of folks also is the reliability of the grid and associated costs. And according to U.S. News and World Report, New York is actually 10th in grid reliability. So I don't know if there's any comment you can make as far as these mandates and milestones, how it relates to improving that, where that focus has been to continue New York's competitiveness on the electric infrastructure and costs. I just thought that's obviously another component in all these mandates, correct? So
yeah, so the Public Service Commission is squarely focused on cost and reliability. So they're pushing on that all the time. We will need to, we've been doing a bunch of studies as part of the Climate Act work to understand what the impact is going to be on the grid of electrifying. One thing it's going to do right now, we have a summer peaking grid, right? The peak load is on a hot August afternoon when everybody has their air conditioning on. Once you electrify the heating of all of the buildings and space and hot water, then the peak will shift to the winter time, we think sometime in the middle of the 30s. So that means that you're going to take more load on a cold morning in January or February than you will in an August afternoon. And why that's important, of course, is that the grid is built to serve peak. It's not built to serve your total hours of electricity usage over a year. It's got to be big enough to handle peak demand. And so that's what's really important for keeping the costs down here. And we're working on these things is ways to shift your load. So using battery storage or thermal storage, or even just having the ability for utilities to come in and essentially tap into your system and lower your load a little bit on a hot afternoon or a cold morning. And that way you reduce your peak, and then you reduce the amount of additional building that we have to do to get to our 100% grid. So we think we're going to be able to do it with very strong reliability, and we're totally focused on doing it at the least marginal cost. So just getting back to some specific regulatory drivers, and then we can stop talking about regulation. You guys can all breathe again. New York City, I've pretty much covered this for local law 97, but they also had a new law passed at the end of 2021, which requires emissions-free new construction in New York City. And the dates are different for your building typology, but it kicks in 2024, that's next year, for single-family houses and low-rise construction, and then 3 years later for larger buildings. So this is law, and people need to be designing their buildings accordingly. And I think it's very hard to imagine why you would not build an all-electric building at this point in time, knowing the regulations that are coming. On the New York State side, as I mentioned, some of these, in fact, most of these do still require another round of legislative approval, and we'll see how that transpires in the next month or so. They're in the governor's budget. We expect the Senate and Assembly, one House bills to drop shortly, and we'll see where we come out there. But there is also an emissions-free new construction regulation that's been proposed. These are all elements, except for the 2 million homes plan at the end. These are all elements that are in the final scoping plan. So that would be very similar to New York City's law, only it's 1 year later for implementation, 2025 for single family and low rise, 2028 for larger buildings. The next one is a pretty powerful regulation, which would say that after these dates certain, 2030 for small, single family low rise, 2035 for larger buildings, after those dates, when your fossil heating appliances reach the end of their useful lives and need replacement, you will not be allowed to replace it with like kind. You would need to electrify at that point. And that's when we want people to be doing this work. You want to use the equipment for the rest of its useful life, not ask everybody to swap out everything at one time. But so that's coming. That's before the legislature this year also. There's a building performance standard that is, this one is actually EUI based, energy use intensity, because it's paired with that phase out of fossil heating appliances. You don't need to regulate the GHG level. There's a benchmarking bill that's involved, that's out in the legislature today. The scoping plan included a cap and invest program, which I think is really interesting, and that's going to get a lot of attention going forward. The idea there, we have these in place in other ways, and other, right now we have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that does a similar program for power plants, but this would actually put a cap on emissions that the top level, they call it the regulated entities, but think gas suppliers, heating oil, gasoline, that and some industry, you'd have to buy allowances to pollute, to release emissions. And those allowances, there would be fewer put into the market as you go forward year to year. And that puts a market price on what people will pay to buy those allowances. Those prices very likely get passed on to customers. So, fossil fuels will stop being, their detriment will stop being externalized. The other piece of this is that the proceeds from these allowance sales would then be invested back into the state. And the current proposal is about a third of them. A third of the amount would go back to taxpayers individually. And then the other 2/3 would be available mostly for clean energy work, but also for some just transition and workforce retraining for people who need to shift their jobs from one place to another for the new economy. The last piece here is a governor's initiative called the 2 Million Climate Friendly Homes that came. It's about complying with the CLCPA, but it's not in it. But this targets having 1 million efficiently electrified housing units, and that's single family or apartment units, and 1 million electrification ready, meaning ready to drop a heat pump in and have it work properly. And the target date there is 2030. So a lot of NYSERDA's actions right now, certainly on the residential team, are about scrambling and coming up. We're well along in the development of an action plan for how we actually achieve that. But that's going to drive a lot of the work in New York State as well. And I talked about the financial institution, the DFS regulations. There's also at the federal level, we expect a rule to come out from the SEC requiring climate disclosures for public companies. So that's going to be a big driver as well. I think I'll stop there and go to the next slide.
Okay, so thanks so much, Greg. I think that was a fantastic overview of just what's going on the regulation side. And New York obviously is doing some pretty amazing stuff and ahead of the curve. Now we're just going to dive in a little on IRA resources. What are the opportunities for affordable housing? We have to meet this stuff, right? Local Law 97. Hearing this stuff's expensive, right? There's going to be fines, and so there's sort of 3 buckets that we're going to highlight today. For solar and energy, the stuff that we're highlighting today that's sort of available now is federal, right? So there are tax credits, right, for solar investment tax credits. I think a lot of folks know about that. But through the IRA, this new legislation, it doubled from 26%. Now the base is at 30%. You can get up to around 50% or even more, additional 10% for a credit on low-income communities. So it was really specific, this legislation, to sort of ensure that the tax credits were flowing to affordable housing and to disadvantaged communities. And there's also, another 20% increase, right, for qualified low-income projects that Jared's going to get into a little bit later. There's also a tax credit for battery storage that's newer in the IRA legislation. And I think one of the biggest things is that nonprofits can take cash payments in lieu of the tax credit. On the energy side, this is really specific to capital and sort of cash coming in through IRA. There is new energy efficient home credit. It's a tax credit that you could stack with the low income housing tax credit. And then there's also additional money coming in through state energy offices through the IRA. So there's a homes rebate program, and there's also a high efficiency home rebate program. So there's quite a few in the billions, not a small amount. That's going to be allocated to state energy offices, right? New York, that is NYSERDA, and NYSERDA is working out. Greg and a bunch of folks internally are figuring out, obviously, how that funding is being allocated through specific programs. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, I think a lot of folks have heard about that. That is $27 billion allocated specifically to the EPA to administer to state energy offices and to intermediaries, and 15 billion of that is targeted to low income and disadvantaged communities. So how that's broken down, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, 7 billion is going to state, cities, tribes, and nonprofit lenders, and that is specific to low income and disadvantaged communities. 8 billion is to nonprofit lenders of that amount, and that's also specifically for low-income and disadvantaged communities, and that's direct funding through intermediaries. And then around 11.7 or 12 billion, give or take, is also to nonprofit lenders, and that's direct funding through intermediaries. So that 7 billion carve out is for public entities. And then the rest is really specifically targeted to intermediaries. So that's how the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is going to be split, and it's administered through the EPA, but the notice of funding, that's not coming out until the summer. So I know a lot of people are trying to coordinate and understand how to go in and apply for that funding, but that is not coming out until the summer. And there are a lot of conversations happening at the state and at the city level from the public side to sort of intermediary side on sort of the best avenue for New York to apply for those funds, because they are going to be quite robust. I go to the next slide for timing. So IRA direct benefits. So, you know, we talked a lot about Local Law 97. And so I think what we want to talk about is how the direct benefits from the IRA can really help us meet the state's 2 million homes goal, and also help us meet the city's Local Law 97 goals, right? So Jared's going to go in a little bit and just talk about the solar investment tax credit and the 45L, and how some of these things on the federal side, while we're still trying to understand Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, we're still trying to understand how some of these sort of incentives are flowing in to the state energy office, but there really is an advantage through IRA on the tax credit side to help folks start to think through how you can kind of stack this into your deals to meet some of the state and the city goals.
Great. So as Paul stated, I'm Jared Lang. I am an affordable housing developer and an energy developer, and I work with a lot of housing owners just trying to figure out financing for solar and energy projects. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some key points from the new Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm sure you know it's been around a little bit since 2022, and you've heard some things, but I think the main takeaways are they're really trying to target us in the affordable housing community and offering specific incentives to help put solar on top of affordable housing. You know, one of the things they've done that we've always had a challenge with is they've authorized the tax credit for 10 years. It used to sunset all the time and be confusing. Another thing that they've done is they've added a pretty substantial bonus on top of the standard credit for putting solar directly on top of regulated affordable housing. So our LIHTC deals, which is pretty interesting and helpful. There's going to be an application process, and we're starting to line up deals for that bonus. Then one of the other things that I just wanted to mention was direct pay, which is essentially for nonprofits are able now to get, who don't have a tax interest, are able to get a refund from the IRS for the amount of the tax credit. This is only for nonprofits and government entities, not for profits. So, which is nice though, kind of, you know, presents some new structuring options for us with nonprofits. And the other program that I wanted to mention, it's a separate program, separate from the tax credit, is this 45L tax credit program. And, you know, for some people in less progressive states, this is, you know, this is a tax credit for achieving Energy Star or DOE's net zero energy. And this might be a bit of a hurdle for people in, you know, other states, Texas, things like that. But in New York, we have to meet these requirements by local laws and the requirements of some of our funding. So in some respects, you know, this is part of Enterprise Green Communities. So in some respects, this is actually just sort of money on the table that we just need to just collect. There's a tax credit up to $5,000 per unit, and you know, on a 100-unit property, that's, you know, we're talking about 500 grand for not doing much more than what we've already been required to do. Next slide. I'm happy to answer questions on that. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about, even for the for-profits that have a tax interest, there was always a real challenge before the IRA utilizing all the tax credits. And now we have an option to either utilize the tax credits internally or to sell them. They're transferable now. This is really exciting. They're worth more if you can utilize them internally, of course, because you're paying for some transaction costs and things. And you know, my sources are telling me that these credits are 80 to 90 cents on a dollar, if we want to sell them off, which is very much worthwhile. Next slide. This is just kind of a little sample of, you know, 3 New York City solar projects that I'm looking at. You can, next slide. So, you know, this is a little overview just to give you a bit of a sense of the economics of what's happening now with the new tax incentives, the New York State incentives. So that project, you know, those 3 projects combined was about 335 kW of solar. That's how we size it in terms of kilowatts. The upfront cost for that is about $1 million. And since this is on affordable housing and there's a bonus, we're able to get about 50% back in tax credits. And then New York Sun has updated their programs for solar specifically on top of affordable housing. And we're able to get about another $500,000 on that 335 kW. And so we're paying for almost entirely the whole upfront cost. And then we're seeing some, you know, annual energy savings of about $50,000 to $60,000 from this 330 kW. And that'll run for like 20 years. So these are the kinds of deals that I'm working through with a lot of developers now. It's an exciting time. The bonus, I would say, is a 2-year. We have kind of a 2-year bite at it, and we need to act quickly. So that's my piece.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think we have some questions in the queue, but Jared, to your last point, you know, I had wanted to ask, you know, just generally about process. And again, you mentioned a 2-year time frame. What next steps can be taken to secure these incentives? How long is that process? I mean, depending on, you know, what type of incentive and benefit you're seeking, and how long is this money available for, which I'm sure our audience, you know, would have questions for, because after all, speed to market's important, drives the IRR for all sorts of deals. So maybe you and Esther can just make some general comments on that. Just curious about what your perspective is.
Yeah. So, you know, there's this, like I said, there's a 2-year strip of this low income bonus. It can be used over the course of 4 years. So we have a little bit of flexibility. They're starting to roll out the guidance on it. They're very much building the car while they're driving it. And there's a carve out specifically for solar on top of regulated housing. So I actually think their expectation, it's going to be hard to meet the amount that they have, but I think people are going to be pretty clever and quickly reserve. People are working with their solar installers and us to pull together some basic project information and make reservations for this adder, this bonus. And there's going to be an opportunity in July or August that's going to come out where we need to start to reserve.
So I'll just go through some of these. Esther, do you have anything? Oh, sorry. No. It's just some of these questions that came in. I don't know if this is for Greg. One question was, how does cap and invest differ from cap and trade? If anyone wants to take that.
I am not an expert on this, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I believe that cap and trade is really the trading is really about different entities trading the allowances among themselves. So it's not about, I don't think that the trading part is about what do you do with the proceeds from those allowances. I suppose you could have a trading mechanism and an investment mechanism, but ours is about, and there's nothing, well, this for the state, it hasn't been written yet. So it's a lot of speculation here, but you should be able to, I believe it's envisioned that somebody who doesn't buy allowances at the auction could then buy them on the, from one of the entities that did buy it. But invest is really about what you do with the proceeds and investing those proceeds into clean energy action. That's one of the drawbacks of the New York City law, is that they're required, as I understand it, they were not allowed to ring fence the penalties that are paid to say, yeah, we're going to use these to, help low income houses meet their obligations. You have to just put it in the general fund. So that's the big difference.
Yeah, it sounds a little more like California's cap and trade or cap and invest program, right? Where you have a cap on emissions, and then the state kind of decides where that's going to be invested. And a lot of that has been invested in affordable housing development through specific state programs.
Yeah, I think the devil's going to be in how many entities are raising their hands to try to get a portion of the proceeds, and who makes those determinations, and do you put it into the general fund or not, and things like this.
Okay. Let's say in the effort, try to get to most of these questions. I don't know, Esther or Jared, do we know, has IRS guidance been published on how nonprofits will access the cash payments that we've mentioned? I don't know that.
I think yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward in that there are forms that you can file along with your sort of annual filings. There I forget the specific number of the form, but it's already out.
Okay.
And come 2023 or come tax time, you file. Your tax return reflects a refund and they send a payment.
The question, which I don't know if they're designated communities now, but how, and what we're talking about, we talk about low income and disadvantaged communities. Are there designated communities? How is that defined? And how does that impact if there's low income development in a high income area? But that's like, how is
so there's like 4 different ways to meet the requirement of LMI. So there's a community solar and subscribers and stuff like that approach. So one of them is they follow the new market tax credit areas, low income community areas. You can search them. And another one is if you have a formally regulated, if you have a federal regulation, like a covenant on your property that you can show, that's a slam dunk. For LIHTC, Section 8, some of the state programs. That's the easiest way. And then I believe there are some ways to qualify, like residents individually, up to 200% of the poverty level. I think that's the guidance. But I can, if Carol, if you want, you can email me and I can reference that for you. I could send you the reference.
Yeah, it can get pretty complicated because you've got the federal definition of disadvantaged communities. Then you've got what the state is doing. We had an entire working group under our Climate Action Council establishing, what does a disadvantaged community mean under the State Climate Act? They can be different, unfortunately. You could be in a low-income housing development in a high-income community and not qualify as a disadvantaged community, but then there are other programs that are aimed at affordable housing. So like Jared said, if you are clearly regulated in your covenants, then there are other benefits that you can get from being regulated housing, but it's complicated.
Another question, how does local law 97 impact new construction? I believe because new construction, there are already code requirements and guidelines for that's kind of the answer there, unless, as far as I understand, unless anyone has anything else to add to that, it's more for existing buildings. But because
once your building exists,
Yeah.
once you've built it, it will be subject to local law 97. I saw that question, that the local law 97 doesn't say you have to reduce by X%. It says you need to meet this cap of emissions from your building based upon your square footage. So new buildings will come under that regulatory environment, just like existing buildings. And if you build it with local law 97 in mind, you should be able to, future-proof yourself at least to 2035.
Yeah. I mean, it's about looking at really specific design guidelines, I would say, right? If you're looking at greenhouse gas emission reductions, it's not just about energy savings. HCR came out with their new design guidelines. The State Housing Agency, I think, is a pretty good example or proxy for what you'd have to meet on the new construction side. There's sort of stretch goals or things that meet net zero or things that meet passive house-like standards, which I think would fall under the local law 97 compliance. So just really looking at those standards that maybe the state is setting. I know HPD new design guidelines, it's going sort of surpassing the baseline of things like green communities, but would be more in the vein of like a green communities plus if it's affordable housing, meeting stretch goals, getting things electrification ready or electrified if you are new construction, is really sort of the name of the game to make sure that you're kind of meeting that timeline and that trajectory, so you don't have to pull things out, right, of your property.
I think you all can see some of these questions. Jared, I don't know if you want to start. There was two related to the LIHTC, one, the application process.
Yeah.
So for the credit value, I don't know if you wanted to touch base on those.
I see the application process. They have not released the formal guidance. What I'm hearing is, just from some of the questions that they're asking and things like that, I think they're thinking sort of about a reservation system, kind of a first come, first serve type of thing. Do not quote me on this, but we're collecting some basic information on, addresses, project sizes, production, stuff like that, just to be ready to apply. And then, are there examples of tax credits being financed to pull forward the credit value and potentially use in the capital stack for a oh, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, 99% of the building stock is existing and 1% of it is being built. So, we are trying to access all of those existing assets, but if you have a new project, we highly recommend that you roll in the solar into your financing. If it's LIHTC, you work with your LIHTC investor to take the investment tax, the solar tax credits, and you roll it together, and you can get more than 100% of the cost paid for. And we're working with a couple developers right now on just modeling that. Does that answer that question, Paul?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's what this is all about. So I think that was helpful. I'm just scrolling through team. If I missed anything,
Looks like there was a question on water. It's an important part of the climate. Where's it in sort of legislation?
Yeah, so water is also an important part of the climate conversation. Where is water included in legislation, financial incentives, etc.? So another question that came in. Anyone?
Yeah, I don't know, Greg, if you want to talk about that on the legislation side.
As far as I know, the State Climate Act is not talking about water conservation. And there are a lot of elements about clean water and wastewater treatment and emissions from wastewater plants. But I'm not in DEC. I don't know if there are other water savings regulatory drivers. I just don't know. I agree that it's an important issue.
Yep.
Sorry for that non-answer.
No, and then generally on the it kind of goes hand in glove in a lot of ways with like energy efficiency if you're doing low flow and
Sure.
changing out toilets and things like that. So I think it could be applicable to some of the stuff that would be, and maybe some of the baseline things that folks are doing. But I think with the 45L and a lot of these sort of home energy efficiency programs, there's going to be just a lot of money, frankly, to cover the full cost for some of those baseline things that have a lot to do with water. It's a lot of the low hanging fruit. It's not a lot of the deep stuff. I think we talk about deep and we talk about passive house, but water really falls into some of the low hanging fruit. And I know some of the sort of city and state agencies there are a lot of in New York green roof programs and just sort of incentives to do water capture and things like that. There are quite a few grant programs that New York does offer around water.
Yeah, there's a lot of energy required to pump water around buildings. So
right.
Water efficiency measures often are eligible measures for financing programs, for example, for
That's right.
commercial PACE financing.
That's right.
You can put water efficiency measures in there.
Yep.
There was a question, I don't know, as particularly Esther, Jared, about the brownfield. The New York State Brownfield Cleanup Program is supposed to offer tangible project tax credits for brownfield sites that are cleaned up and redeveloped into renewable energy facility sites. Do the panelists have any insight or experience with the New York State income tax credit for brownfield sites? Just guessing, I think there may be separate tax credits available if there's a brownfield cleanup in the energy, but I don't know if there's any insight more than that. I'm not about that overlap.
The only thing I know about that is a program called Build Ready that the state runs, which is looking for sites like this for utility scale renewable developments and trying to get them ready to go and then turn it over to a developer who doesn't then need to go through the whole process of getting regulatory approval from the local jurisdictions. So I know that there's a focus on brownfield sites. I don't have particular experience with utilizing those credit mechanisms, but I do think it's one of our ideas for how to expand the opportunity for clean energy is to look at brownfield tax credits and perhaps have a bump on that tax credit if you then go beyond cleaning up the brownfield and actually install clean energy there.
Thanks, Greg. Looking at these remaining questions, are you seeing CPACE financing as an available source of financing towards these efforts? I'm sure, Esther, if you want to comment how CPACE fits in or not on affordable housing construction or preservation.
Yeah, I mean, I think New York is kind of unique, and there are a lot of financing options in New York if you're looking at financing and not just sort of grants or tax credits, right? So it takes the whole kit and caboodle to get this stuff done. We're talking about tax credits, we're talking about debt on the financing side, and then there's also the free money. New York through NYSERDA's programs or Con Ed programs. There's a lot of grant sort of funds out there as well. But I would say CPACE, it's sort of one avenue. It hasn't necessarily worked amazingly with affordable housing just because of the terms and the rates. I think with a lot of affordable housing, when you're looking at sort of traditional mortgage products, sometimes PACE doesn't necessarily compete with the sort of the rates and the terms that you can get on sort of the mortgage lending side. So if someone's going in to kind of refinance, sometimes that's like a sort of a better opportunity. But I would say on the debt side, you know, we do have a lot of sort of interesting, I would say nuanced energy lenders, you know, whether it's New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, which is a locally specific green bank. You know, there is the New York Green Bank. There is Inclusive Prosperity Capital. There are a lot of folks providing, you know, equipment type innovative lending that's sort of out there that I know, you know, me and Jared have worked with back and forth on a lot of deals. You kind of want to size where you're getting on the equity side, and then you kind of pare it down what kind of sponsor equity can go into a deal, and then you sort of look at what kind of free money and grants, and you sort of size the projects and the needs based on you know, what the debt need is for that project, and then kind of look out in the market in terms of what it could serve. So I wouldn't say it's sort of a shoe in, it's just another sort of financing avenue or product, and something to kind of look at and compare and contrast with what's out in the market.
Yeah, but it is available for affordable housing. That's
Mhm.
it's considered a commercial building for CPACE.
Yep.
We're trying to modify the guidance that NYSERDA puts out for CPACE. I can't really say a lot about that because it's a work in progress, but the idea is to open it up to be eligible for more projects
Mhm.
in terms of the cost benefit ratio and things like that. New York City has its own CPACE program, and you know, unfortunately, the city is a little overwhelmed these days, and NYSEC, the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, is the administrator for New York City, but they're being held back by, I mean, the program is open, but it's underutilized mostly for lack of focus by the city and getting their rules done, for example, for new construction. And there's no political objection, it's just manpower issues as far as I understand it.
I think one last question, because we're running out of time. If I missed anything, questions, apologies, you can always email me, paul@capalino.com, and try to get it answered. Last question, can you speak to how nonprofit CDFIs will be able to access the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? Are there certain types that will be more targeted, preferred for allocation? If a CDFI is based in more than one state, how will this work? Any insight on that from
Yeah.
our panel?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think the notice hasn't come out. There has been some guidance from the EPA. CDFIs are certainly eligible as a nonprofit lender. You're 100% eligible to go in for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And I would say there are a lot of folks thinking about it. There's CDFIs, there's very large intermediaries and smaller CDFIs. I know you know, I'm talking to some folks maybe at OFN, or some larger intermediaries might be kind of pertinent to make sure that you're potentially under an umbrella application. If there are quite a few people going in, it's going to be quite competitive. And I know the guidance said that there's about only around 2 to 15 applicants are going to be given the funding, and that's not a lot. So I would say if you're having those conversations, maybe laddering up to some of the national, whether it's HPN or OFN groups, to kind of coordinate and collaborate would be my advice.
Yeah, I think they're clearly focused on coalitions. It's, as I hear it, it's more likely toward the lower end of that number of awards.
Yep.
Right, which for $20 billion mean, you know, if you're going to award it to 2 to 5 entities, means you're thinking that those entities are then going to act to disperse the funding. But yes, I would absolutely recommend talking to some larger CDFIs to get within a tent. Calvert is another one that I keep hearing as a potential lead applicant.
Yep. So talking to those tent organizations would probably be the smartest strategy.
Okay, great. Well, any additional questions, or if I missed a couple, apologies, just please email me, paul@capalino.com. Also, there was a question about getting a copy of the presentation. You can email me there as well. I'll be happy to share that. So on behalf of Capalino and our panel, I thought that, you know, did a great job explaining all the programs and going through all the regulatory drivers. And thank you very much for attending. And you know, we'll be in touch with our next Future of New York session. So thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much for having us.
Thanks, Paul,
Yeah.
and thanks everybody for
Take care.
tuning in.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.